So we didn't get a break in between. Yeah, like the break is going to be after, but I just wanted to take a moment because those breaks give us time to digest the things that we just heard from the previous speaker. And with so much wealth of gift and offering that Lana just gave us, I just want to take like a collective breath. So we can breathe that in and digest what Lana just gave us before we go on to working with whatever the heck it is I'm going to say. Which, much like Lana was saying, this is going to be an adventure. We're going to go on an adventure together, because as much as I can have talking points here, I promise nothing about whether I will diverge on this topic that has so many different branches of nuance to it. I don't even have to look behind me. It's right there. That's so great. Can we give a round of applause for a second for our AV people who've been helping us this entire time? And I also want to thank the Nova Scotia Hospice and Palliative Care Association for having this topic and allowing us to come and speak here the way we've been speaking. And I don't know about the other speakers here today, but being part of a group that's forced into the margins, sometimes when you're invited to a space, it's because they want to hear about your resilience and how awesome and inspirational you are. And they want to commodify your experience rather than allow you to call people into it. So this association is allowing us to call everyone in and expand our world together. So thank you. There's a lot of beautiful land acknowledgements that already happened today from a lot of different perspectives. So I'm going to take a moment to do something a little different and impromptu and have a land invitation into the work of reconciliation with something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And this is the question that maybe you can take and ponder for yourself later. When it comes to our policies, laws, and regulations surrounding life and death and what we do with our bodies, how do they affect land back? How do they affect work for reconciliation? And how do our personal choices about what we do with our bodies after death on this land of Unamagi, Mi'kma'ki, how does that affect land back, especially when we have limited land here and cemeteries and graveyards that are expanding? How does our choice for where we put our bodies affect land back and Indigenous sovereignty? So, and if you need an answer to that question, who do you need to ask and what voices need to be in the room? And that one's semi-rhetorical because we know who. Some disclaimers before we begin. What's going to be presented today could be an entire multi-module course. I'm not going to be able to cover everything and anything and everything from every angle, but it is my hope that sharing this will spark curiosity that can grow into changes in the way that we approach grief care. This is supposed to be a conversation full of seeds, and every single piece can be expanded on in different ways. I also want to acknowledge that this topic, Grieving While Ungrievable, does not belong to 2S and LGBTQ+ people alone. And what's written and shared today draws on shared histories and lineages of knowledge spanning multiple groups who have borne the weight of dehumanization for centuries and since time immemorial. While the works and the words of the people here featured today are meaningful in shaping this discourse, I cannot vouch for everything and anything they've ever done or said. So today we're giving flowers where flowers are due. But I also want to make space for the fact that people are human and we all have different versions of unlearning to do. So even these people who have really amazing and wonderful words that we're going to listen to today, and even myself, who obviously has amazing, wonderful words to share with you today, we're human. There's going to be things where we trip up and things where we fall short and times where we say something that's really amazing that we don't apply it in all the places that we might need to apply it. So let's leave that there for a second. Let's start here. What is queer grief? When thinking about doing a presentation about 2S LGBTQ plus grief, we could talk about all the places that exist where there's discrimination and prejudice. We could list off all the losses that queer people go through and to, but I want to do something a little different. I want to peel a layer deeper, which also means zooming out a bit more, which means that we have to start with this question. And what's really important about this question, what is queer grief, is the word choice. The answer to this question is in the word choice, and specifically in the word queer. Queer is a word that exists in this community with celebration and tension. It's a word that was used to dehumanize queer people at some point in our history. And by at some point, I mean literally a stone's throw backwards. And it is a word that has been undergoing reclamation and becoming a word of celebration and rehumanization today. So when we're thinking about queer grief, we're talking about the tension between dehumanization and rehumanization. And that's what we're going to be exploring. It is impossible, in my opinion, to effectively care for queer grief experiences without acknowledging a context of ungrievability within which queer people live. It is impossible to care for queer grief without confronting the reality of the purpose of that dehumanization and the ways we and our systems are complicit in and benefit from it. This is a wonderful quote by Achille Mbembe, who did this wonderful essay, Necropolitics, which then expanded into a book of multiple essays, which is also simultaneously named Necropolitics. And if you don't have it on your book list, get it on your book list. In my opinion, this is a book that every single person who works with death and grief and loss in any regard should have read this book and understand the topics that come within it. And I'll give you a heads up, there's some moments where it's a dry read, but it's really, really, really valuable and really worth it. Does anyone else know this book? We got some reading to do in this room. This quote, "The ultimate expression of sovereignty largely resides in the power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die." The word sovereignty in this quote is referring to sovereignty of nations and how we choose to have power within those nations. When we were talking earlier about racism, and racism from Dr. Arya, from racism equaling racial prejudice plus power, what do we really mean when we say power? Because when we examine it further, and as Achille Mbembe is suggesting here, ultimately what we mean when we say power is that we mean power over who lives and power over who dies. Power over our own ability to choose when we live, and power over our own ability to choose when we die to the best of our abilities. That is power. Because when you talk about nations having power, we're talking, oh, well, they have resources. And they can get in, you can get into certain rooms and certain offices. We can access medical care. What does all that add up to? It is the power to decide who lives and who dies, and that's what they mean by necropolitics. The politics and power of death and who controls it. Moving to Judith Butler and their book Frames of War, they bring in the word ungrievability inspired by necropolitics. One way of posing the question of who we are in these times of war is by asking whose lives are considered valuable and whose lives are mourned and whose lives are considered ungrievable. What does it mean to be oppressed and discriminated against? When we have prejudice towards someone, what does that mean? We use those words. What does it mean? It means that their losses don't matter to us. It means that when they experience loss, we don't care. It means that our worldviews, our belonging to certain communities matter more than their lives. That's what that means. And I think that's important to call out in these conversations when we're talking about prejudice. We're talking about life and death. Death and grief, life and death, power over who has power over all of this, shapes our communities. You know, we want to think that we're in communities because we love each other, and that's true, we do love each other, but we're also in communities together because we want to survive. And at its base, we're here connecting in places to survive together. I want to draw on looking at how death and grief shape our communities by also drawing on this wonderful 1 hour long amazing YouTube video by philosopher Abigail Thorne, How Death Changes Your Perspective. And they're also drawing on this article on the forgetting of corporate irresponsibility, looking at how corporations and businesses shape community and their irresponsibility in shaping community. But in that, we look at how communities can be, if we really boil it down, communities can be shaped by two things, and that's knowledge and affect. Knowledge means what a community lets into the realm of knowledge and what a community keeps in the realm of ignorance. So like the question we had earlier, and like you were talking about with Lana, like for example, there are faith communities who let in a lot of knowledge about relationship and care and community and being with each other in lots of beautiful ways. There are also faith communities who, while simultaneously letting that knowledge in, keep in the realm of ignorance the knowledge about LGBTQ and queer plus existence. That is something you don't talk about. We don't talk about that. We don't believe that. I don't care how much data you put in front of my face, it doesn't exist. We keep it in the realm of ignorance. And that is part of what defines who gets to be in our room with us and who does not. And what comes around with that simultaneously is affect, which is what a community is supposed to feel towards something and what a community is not supposed to feel, which in other terms means what a community is allowed to grieve and what we are not. Some people are ungrievable. In order for societies, organizations, which are mnemonic, they're talking about knowledge, and affect communities to continue functioning, some people's lives must not matter. We are allowed to know about their deaths, but we must not feel bad about it. When ungrievable people die, instead of listening to the angels of our better nature, we are supposed to feel indifference or righteous coldness. During the AIDS crisis, which got overwhelmingly placed on the shoulders of queer people despite not being a queer-only disease, there was celebration that queer people were dying. People were happy to be rid of them, of us. They took pleasure in the fact that they weren't us. And that determined who they got to be in community with during those times. So when we look at queer grief and supporting queer grief, we're supporting a people who are being consistently made ungrievable on a daily basis by multiple parts of our systems, regulations, and policies, and the interpersonal relationships of our communities. And that is a very important context. Because when we look at grief and loss, a lot of the times we're thinking it's because of an event that has happened that is past. But what about the things that are ongoing? What about the things that are continued every day? How do you care for people who are being murdered in slow motion? Because when we're talking about ungrievability, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about removing a person's humanity systemically, piece by piece by piece, until no one cares when we finally kill them. How do we care for that? Ungrievable lives are those who cannot be lost and cannot be destroyed because they already inhabit a lost and destroyed zone. They are ontologically and from the start already lost and destroyed, which means that when they are destroyed in war, nothing's destroyed because there's nobody there. I want to take a moment to give you all some time to reflect. We have some pads of paper and pens on the table, but I'd love for us to reflect on where in your own lives have you been, subtly or not, led to believe that certain behaviors, beliefs, or aesthetics make a person less human? And how does that affect your ability to provide grief care? And if you want to go beyond that, what could a future look like where people's humanity is maintained regardless of their behaviors, beliefs, and aesthetics? And even just for a moment here, maybe let's look around the room for a second before we start reflecting. By show of hands, how many people in this room believe in human rights? Okay, take a moment and look around. That's like everybody. Good for us. Now, keep your hands down because I don't want somebody to out themselves here. Who do you consider human? That's a different question, and that's where that question goes awry. We can all say that we love human rights, but who do you consider human? And is there things and aesthetics and way they dress and way they behave that suddenly precludes them from that category? Where have you been led to believe that there might be behaviors and aesthetics and beliefs that could stop someone from being human and deserving those rights? So I'm going to give y'all like a solid 2 minutes to reflect, and then I'd love to invite a really brave person to share. Y'all are so uncomfy. I love that. All right. Is there anyone in this room who is willing to share reflections on these questions? Yeah. And thank you for coming up. It was a brave conversation. Thank you.
I really don't like this question. It makes me feel really uncomfortable. Once upon a time, I worked in developmental services, and this is why I'm here years later. I used to support a gentleman who had cystic fibrosis, and he was nonverbal and in a wheelchair. And the difficulty is that there's a lot of nuances in the story. But he was less human to the nurses because his wheelchair was taking up space and he was dying and he doesn't need it anyway. And so as a young 20-year-old working, trying to communicate that at that point people continued to use the word retarded. He was retarded and useless, and trying to be a kid myself and make change in society to say that's a terrible, terrifying word to make someone less human. And then to completely take it all away when he didn't even know he was dying from lung cancer. He thought he had pneumonia and he was going to be fine because his family chose not to tell him the truth. To then take everything away from him and say he's never going to need this stupid wheelchair ever again, we should just take it out of the room, was devastating to me. And so the second question here is, today I can do this, but back then, in the situation I was in, where I spent all my ignorance as a child in my 20s trying to figure out how to educate people, I had no idea where to go from there. I didn't even know how to take care of myself because I was broken from his situation. So I hate this question.
Yeah, that's a real reason. Can we get a round of applause here for this heck and bravery? Thank you. And this is also a good time to bring up, once again, the intersectionality of this issue and take a moment to also say, yes, queer people are everywhere. We're everywhere. We're in your churches. We're in your hoedowns. We're in your square dances. We're in your grocery stores. You know, we are everywhere. We are Muslim. We are African diaspora. We are indigenous in almost every single nation all across Turtle Island. We are everywhere. So all of these intersections then matter, and this is why this topic matters. This is the place where we meet. Is there anyone else who would like to share a reflection? And also, please, anyone online, feel free to chime in.
When I looked at the question, I went, I don't think there has been, but there has been lately. And that's social media has been leading me to believe that certain behaviors south of the border make a person less human. And I struggle with that as I hear other people saying, I just wished he would die. And I think that there is that sense in which, because we see things that we're struggling with because of certain people's behavior, that I'm not sure that there would be a lot of grief care by us as a nation if certain people did die. Anyhow, that I couldn't think of anything. I'm like, oh my glory, yes, I'm bombarded with everyone telling me that this person should die, and I'm feeling like, yeah, it'd be nice if he just wasn't around.
Word, round of applause, please, and thank you. Thank you for bringing that up, because that is the place where this conversation about ungrievability really reaches a lot of tension, is how do we hold people's humanity even when their behaviors suck? Like, so bad. Like, what about when they're people who are responsible for mass murder? What about then? How do you care for the grief of a person whose behaviors are oppressive, still maintaining their humanity, while also caring for your grief in witnessing and or being a person who has received that oppression, and maintaining your humanity that you've had to fight for every day. And we can talk more about that towards the end. But thank you. Thank you for bringing this up. What does it take to make a person ungrievable? Achille says, "Is it enough to shoot down enemies and expel foreigners to be truly rid of them, to doom them to the eternity of that which is to be forgotten? This attitude demands that such acts of death and banishment succeed in erasing, during the enemy's life, his death and his relegation, what in his face belonged to his humanity. The undertaking of disfigurement and erasure is almost a precondition for execution within the contemporary logic of hatred." So when we're looking at this in a queer context or with the queer community, we're recognizing this as a lens through which queer people are actively disfigured, thinking about the disinformation that we have about the queer community that goes around regularly. Especially we can see now with the trans community, who's the latest target of the disfigurement, getting the full brunt of it all. This is an active disfiguring. If this was in the physical, this would look like slow torture. But as it exists in this figurative space, it's through our information and through our stories and the stories we allow to be told and the ones that we don't. Again, thinking back to knowledge and affect in our communities. Making ungrievable people, what is involved in dehumanization? What are we taking away when we're disfiguring? Loss of right to a journey. This one, maybe I shouldn't have started with this one, but this one's my favorite one. When we're disfiguring a people, we have to focus on a goal of how a person should look and how they should act and how they should be. We are goal-focused when we are dehumanizing. We're not allowing a person to make mistakes, to have flaws, or to have a journey in their life. We're going to cancel them if we're having a journey. We're just going to focus on, are you this one vision of a goal or are you not? That's all you get. Loss of our rituals and our rights. For queer people, this can also look like loss of our club spaces, loss of our third spaces with each other, loss of cultural artifacts. We know that this happens in a lot of different contexts, but for queer people, loss of cultural artifacts also looks like, the burning of the libraries where there was a bunch of trans research in Germany, and that's gone now, and we can't touch it, which is also a loss of our history. This also looks like, for example, in some indigenous nations and spaces, they don't want to talk about Two-Spirit people and the entire history that exists of Two-Spirit people. And maybe they've even gotten rid of some cultural artifacts that belong to Two-Spirit people. And it's like, or perhaps it was something that was done by non-indigenous people and they can't recover it. Loss of choice and autonomy. If we don't give people choice, we don't give them a journey, we're dehumanizing them. Loss of land and space, we know that one. Loss of access to basic resources, making it harder and harder and harder for people to access food, water, shelter, connection with each other, which I consider a basic resource. Loss of our ancestors and our elders. How, again, during the AIDS crisis, entire queer communities lost a whole generation of elders. So few of us were left that we don't have their stories. That's devastating. Loss of language, which can also just look like don't talk about your pronouns, or even the loss of our ability to change our language as we move and grow, and loss of our imagination. Over time, systemic dehumanization makes it hard to imagine futures. We're so focused on trying to survive in the present, we can't even imagine worlds in which we aren't oppressed and what steps we could take to get there. It's just about what happens tomorrow. If you want a group of people to be ungrievable, the first strategy is simply to not report their deaths. And I want to pause on that because we heard about deaths going unreported earlier today in other people's talks, didn't we? A second technique might be to portray the target population as a kind of dead already. An example might be the portrayal of Indigenous people as quasi-extinct or relics of a dying era, or portraying old and disabled people as half dead already. Queer people, too, are portrayed as courting death through risky lifestyles. The common thread is that death is assumed to have pretty much already happened, so why grieve an already foregone conclusion? Killing people like that is just a matter of ticking a box, another way to attach a negative affect to every mention of them. Philosopher Sarah Ahmed says that if you repeatedly associate a group of people with vermin, cockroaches, disease, infestation, invasion, burdens, other people will adopt an affect of righteous coldness when they die. Another way is to portray the target population as part of a larger threat, like to our children. Have you heard that one? How many people have heard that queer people are a threat to our children? Historically, then, our grief was conditioned out of us. The oppressed had their monuments and memorials torn down. Even language and culture suffocated. The oppressor could not have their subjugated rising up. Grief essentially became banned, colonized, and assimilated. There are areas where we still see colonization and assimilation and a kind of quasi-banning of grief experiences today, which heavily affects the marginalized communities and forcibly marginalized communities that we serve. The oppressed were disallowed their grief, and the oppressor suppressed their own to keep conquering. We inherited this story. So this is again highlighting the dual side of things, because there is grief on all sides. We have the grief suppression of those who are being oppressed in different situations, what they're allowed to and not allowed to grieve. And we also have the oppressor being allowed to and not allowed to grieve certain things in order to keep belonging to a group that has a significant amount of power over resources, aka life and death. Grief is frequently policed by family traditions and cultural institutions. What is appropriate to do, to wear, what are the expectations? And this is from Lawrence Chung, who is a chaplain and certified spiritual care practitioner out in BC. I wanted to highlight this quote also to bring up the point that as much as we can have cultures and traditions which are really uplifting and that root us and ground us, and we have heard today so much about cultures and traditions rooting us and grounding us and uplifting the things that we care about and filling us up and nourishing our lives and being spaces where we can be human. There is also a moment in grief where sometimes we come into tension with our own cultures and traditions, where in the face of death, either from dehumanization or from actual physical mortality, we reconsider the spiritual traditions that we've been a part of. We might see areas that don't fit anymore with our cultures, and then suddenly what our family wants and what we want is different, and how do we navigate that? For queer people, this happens all the time. You know, like when we're talking about faith spaces, how many queer people of faith in the face of dehumanization are faced with the choice of either having to become ignorant of their own self-knowledge of their own self, their own experiences, their own reality, and their own existence in order to remain in a community space? Or do they have to face the loss of being estranged from everyone and everything in that community? Taking a moment for reflection. Are there losses that you have experienced in your own life, either death or non-death losses, that you have believed to be or that have been treated as ungrievable? We're looking at things that are suppressed, demeaned, moments where your expression of loss has been told to calm down, go quiet, been silenced. Is there anyone willing to share an experience? Yeah. Let's get you a mic. Go, mic runner.
This one's a little tricky. I experienced quite a bit of grief, loss of community, loss of a pet. And when I was expressing it with a close friend who was also grieving the loss of her dad, it was shut down because her grief was like, there was like a comparison of grief going on. And I guess that's just one instance where that can happen. Like, people who are like deeply grieving can't hear it from anyone else. So that's one thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I invite you to not be awkward about that story at all. That absolutely counts as a moment where something is made ungrievable. And sometimes we do that to each other, you know, not necessarily with a malevolent intent, but it can be moments where we're feeling particularly scarce about resources for our own care, whether that's from our family or community or actual funding for care, where we then decide that there needs to be a hierarchy of losses and other ones need to not be talked about. And when that comes to queer grief, relating that back here, a lot of the grief that queer people experience is non-death grief. The vast majority of it is daily non-death grief. And all of that gets silenced because, well, we only consider physical death to be the real thing that you grieve, right? Because that's the worst thing we can all experience. But that's not necessarily true for everyone. Thank you.
So the loss of elderly parents, so I'd say that that's one piece of it, especially an elderly parent with dementia.
Yeah.
So a lot of dismissing of sadness and grief and feeling that they're old, they lived their life, or feeling like they've had dementia for 5 years, you lost them 5 years ago. And I think there's a lot of suppression of people's right to feel sad or to grieve those kind of losses. And also loves that are hidden. Like, I don't know a better way to put it, but because I think it's beyond having a relationship with someone who's not attainable or not available, right? And so it's a hidden kind of, and I think it goes beyond just that scenario. There's probably other examples of it where you're not allowed to show the grief that you're experiencing.
Absolutely. And I mean, like, even that loves that are hidden, that's a grief of future possibilities. And I actually just recently read a really amazing research paper, which had a really long title that I absolutely cannot remember for you today, so I'm sorry. But that paper was exploring grief in a different definition and talking about how a lot of our losses and griefs are about how what happens to us in a loss changes how we view the meaning of our past and changes our possibilities for the future. And then that's what the definition of a sense of loss is. So then those griefs count, but we don't get to talk about them, right? Because we have these inherent, implicit hierarchies of who counts and who doesn't. I saw a hand back up. Yeah, you got it.
An area where I see this showing up that somewhat relates to the work that I do is grief of a toxic or abusive partner. And I think there's a lot of conversations around violence prevention, intervention, and response currently going on in the province, given several tragedies that have happened, and there's a lot of work being done there. And I don't know if anybody in the room works in that space, but if they do, I think that's a really, really important part of that work, is understanding the complexities of the emotions when somebody leaves an abusive or toxic partner. The fact that there is almost definitely going to be some form of grief for them, even if it doesn't make sense to us.
Absolutely. 100 and 1,000%. And I'm really excited that you brought that up. As mentioned in my bio, I'm a multi-violence survivor. Some of that for me is through domestic violence. The word survivor to me feels weird, but I'm going to say it today for the sake of explaining to you all what that is. Excuse me for popping the microphone. And there were moments, and there are still moments, where I grieve and miss and long for a person who nearly killed me. There are moments where I miss some of the happy times we had together. There are moments where I miss the way it felt to be with them, the things we did together, the songs we listened to. That's normal. It's very normal to grieve things even if you know that it's better for you not to be there anymore, right? If you have addictions, you can grieve and miss and long for a drug that you were using in the same way that you can grieve an abusive partner. You can grieve an old job where your manager sucked, even if you left that job to get a 2-time bonus to your paycheck and benefits and only work 3 days a week, which I'm sure we all want. But those are things that we can grieve that are hidden from us because, again, they fit in the ungrievable category. It means that we challenge the power structures of our resources and we challenge the viewpoints of our communities when we bring them up. I'm not going to leave you just on the sad stuff. We're going to start moving in towards the what the heck do we do about it part. So, Francis Weller, Wild Image of Sorrow. Who's read it? Yeah, there we go. A couple of, I'm pulling out the obscure books. I need to give y'all a book list after this. So, grief is subversive, undermining the quiet agreement to behave and be in control of our emotions. It is an act of protest that declares our refusal to live numb and small. There is something feral about grief, something essentially outside of the ordained and sanctioned behaviors of our culture. When I read this quote and when I feel into this quote, I think of grief as queer. Queerness is essentially living outside the ordained and sanctioned behaviors of very specific dominant narratives and cultures. But I also think about how many of our communities that have been forcibly marginalized still persist. But we don't persist because we suppress our grief. We persist because we lean into it. Those moments where we refuse and we say, enough, I'm going to talk about those losses. Those are the moments where we gain power. We take back our own control over our own loss ecology. Yet still, oppressed people rose up, grieved and protested in song and dance and art and stories, spirituals and code. Grief can be suppressed, but it cannot be removed. It finds its way to honor the dead, to reclaim stolen dignity. When there is injustice, grief and solidarity are transformation. I think about this when I think about Stonewall, this beautiful action where queer people stood up and said, enough. I think about this when I see people drumming and they refuse to let their song die and be erased. I think about this when I think about Lana sitting here clapping and dancing for church. We think about grief as the weeping, but grief is also the persisting, the resisting. Grief is not the moment of rupture. Grief is the moment of repair that we claim no matter what. It's when we suppress our grief that we drown and that we feel like we're drowning. It's when we lean into it that we find connection, relationship, and repair. And for queer people, that means allowing that expression, even if we don't like how many sparkles or glitter they include in it. Where do you notice enforcement of ungrievability existing in grief care frameworks, theories, research, and practices today? What are the practices, rituals, knowledges, and actions we can take to rehumanize and make each other grievable again? I'd love to get at least one person who has a thought on that. Even one thing we can do in the back.
Well, I was thinking of a very personal example to the previous one that I didn't want to share about how when people miscarry, which I did when I already had a number of kids, it's ungrievable, right? And this whole idea of not telling, people not telling that they're pregnant before a certain time is because then you don't have to tell anybody if you lost your child. So I think that's just an example of a practice or a cultural ritual that reinforces the ungrievability of pregnancy loss.
Yeah, absolutely. I was terrified. I had a miscarriage before I had my child, who now will be 9 in July. I was terrified to talk about that pregnancy, and I was terrified every moment, constantly being like, is there a heartbeat? Is there movement? Can I feel it? And then if I couldn't feel it for an hour, I was like, oh my God, do we need to go to the hospital? The amount of stress. But I also couldn't talk about it with anyone. And I felt like I couldn't talk about it with anyone, and it wasn't really welcome in some of the community spaces that I was in, and even some of the mom groups that I was in. Anyone else? Okay. Ways ungrievability is enforced in the grief care world. Hierarchies of loss, we just talked about that today. All of our funding goes towards mortality, physical mortality, deaths. And funding is limited for caring about grief that comes from other things. This heavily affects the queer space, considering that most of our grief is non-death loss. And that's not to say that we don't have an absolutely significant amount of death loss. We do. But a lot of what we're looking at and a lot of what people are trying to talk about in grief care and support circles, some of which I do up in Cape Breton, is non-death losses. Manufactured scarcity of resources. We don't have funding. Yes, you do. Liars. We know you do. Everyone in this room has seen the weird things that happen with funding and the places where they skimp on us. Research samples exclude populations. All right, so we've got all these theories and frameworks of grief, right? It's 5 stages of grief. We've got the dual model. We got Tonkin's model of grief. We got all those models and theories and frameworks. They are considered evidence-based. For who? Because when you look at the research, the vast majority of it is off a sample of white, middle-aged women grieving the loss of their husbands. That's an incredibly narrow sample, and they were just like, cool, we got everybody covered. White women, they know everything, right? So we got everybody covered. But that's not true, and that's a thing that is recognized in research papers, critiquing research papers by outspoken and very well-known voices in the grief world, like Niemeyer. Anyone know Niemeyer's work? Yeah, there you go. So Niemeyer is sitting there being like, we got a really big, they have a whole research paper on it. They're like, hi, so we have a really large quantity of grief research, but the quality sucks. And that's part because we're excluding sample populations that aren't that very, very, very narrow population. So when you go into grief care and you're talking about something evidence-based, again, ask for who? For who? Disconnect between researchers and service providers. Okay, so we have a lot of great research, and some more research is coming out, especially about queer grieving. But what researchers know and what service providers know about that research, there's a massive disconnect between those two things. And it's in large part because, and what this is something they're exploring now, is that there is a social aspect of maintaining old ideas of grief care, like we were talking about with ungrievability and shaping our communities, that is affecting the research we actually accept from researchers. So researchers are saying, hey, actually grief's a little different, and we're not actually totally even sure about the definition. How many people in this room are aware that researchers do not have a unified definition of grief? Yeah, they don't. And yet our service providers are saying, yeah, it's a feeling. It's synonymous with sadness. We don't know that. There's actually a whole bunch of different definitions when you look at it in research. But this disconnect is in part because of this phenomena of ungrievability and what that would mean we would need to reshape about our communities. Overemphasis on licensed practitioners over lived experience care practitioners. If lived experience people are not in the room, we are going to have a discrepancy of care. And this is really important when it comes to communities like the 2S LGBTQ plus community, because we take care of us. Marginalized communities, we take care of us. We're actually not devoid of care. We talk about these marginalized communities like they don't have access to care. It's that we have suppressed care. The care that we try to give each other gets consistently suppressed and shut down. We don't actually need you. We need you to get out of our way sometimes. And that's not to say you don't have something valuable to add to the conversation. You absolutely do. But you're not coming in here banking model style and putting grief into us and care into us. You're here to empower us to do our care with our knowledge and to share in that and be part of our communities. Grief as a liability. Who has heard that grief care is a liability, so they can't do a grief support circle because it's a liability? Yeah, I've actually had that happen. They're like, okay, so grief is a little bit, of a sketchy topic, and we don't want people to get too sad because we're scared then that'll touch into suicidality, so therefore it's a liability. I've encountered that multiple times, which is really interesting. Now, it's easier if you're a licensed practitioner, because then they assume you're going to be fine no matter what you do. But then how does that affect lived experience and community level care practitioners, right? Grief as synonymous with pain and sorrow. We talked about that. Limiting the definition of grief limits our ability to recognize what's grievable and ungrievable. Timelines. Who's heard the old timeline thing? You need to get over it in a certain amount of time. Yeah. Ideas of recovery tied to labor productivity, overemphasis on forgiveness and positivity. All of these things can play subtle factors into our ability to access grief and ultimately limit our expression. And again, I'm not saying that forgiveness isn't a thing we can't have in grief. We absolutely can. But emphasizing it to the point of pressuring people to forgive, that's different. Rehumanization. Here's some ideas about how we could potentially restore humanization that can help and support queer people in grief. Restoration of choice and self-determination in care. Choice and self-determination in care is humanization. It is humanizing. It says that what you think and know about yourself matters. Grief as relational. Lana talked about this earlier, about the relationality of everything, about everything being a relationship. Grief doesn't exist without relationship. Dismantling hierarchies of loss, including the voices we need to include in research, leaning on community level care, expanding capacity for expression, challenging our own internalized fears and pleasures around making someone else other. Collaboration and circling between care providers. It would be so cool if instead of hierarchies between care providers, we could recognize ourselves as part of a circle of care, all of whom are on equal level and has something to contribute. Denial of responsibility and denial of complicity is part of refusing to know what's what. It blocks the kind of grief that can realign the soul and that allows us to ultimately be free. No matter what we all think about ourselves as good people in this room, all of us, to some measure, have some complicity in making something ungrievable for someone else. How do we take responsibility for that and take responsibility for our complicity and come into our own grief around that so that we can be free? Precisely because a living being may die, it is necessary to care for that being so that it may live. Only under conditions in which the loss would matter does the value of life appear. Thus, grievability is a presupposition for a life that matters. So what are some of the takeaways that we can take from this about queer grief? We came here to talk about queer grief, but when I talked about ungrievability, how many other kinds of grief do we hear in the room? A lot. So when you say, I don't know anything about queer grief, yes, you do. Queer grief centers in the context of ungrievability. And yes, we have more than that in our queer grief experiences. But for today, I would love you to sit on that concept about how that is a bridge between us and a bridge between our experiences. And how does that concept of ungrievability affect your grief care? It makes the key to that grief care acts of radical rehumanization. And a lot of that comes in our challenges to our systems. And that even means the systems that we enact complicitly as licensed providers in our care. And usually I'd add a space for questions, but we had lots of shares here, and I think I'm short on time. I am short on time. If you have a few questions, yeah, we can have a few questions here. I brought the heavy topic, hey? Yeah. Last call for if anyone has a question they'd like to ask. If you do have a question that you feel awkward about asking in the room, I will be here for just a short bit after this conference is done, and you can find me and ask that question there. Thank you all.